Zidane, Electro Ninja here, and welcome back to Intrepid Books. Today's lesson is going to be that of introduction words. Obviously, there are a ton of words in Acieo, and really the best way to start is with how to introduce yourself, obviously. So let's actually get started with our introductory words. Now, obviously, if you've been following me on either one of my two channels for a long time, then you've often heard me say the words Zidane and Badan. You've also heard me say the word Deoni. Zidane and Badan are actually one of the two most important words in the Acieo language, being the fact that Zidane is basically the way of saying hello, and Badan is the way of saying goodbye, which actually is pretty interesting, to say the least. First off, let's actually break down the second part of these. On, which is actually means good. So, yeah, good is actually in the second half of both of these words. And that's actually something important to notice is that certain words are actually means a lot of different things. And are actually made up of multiple different words. So, Zidane and Badan, even though they're technically one word, they can actually be primarily they're used as basically saying they're used in that form, but they do have multiple parts. So like I said, on means good, and just so that you guys are aware, the word for bad is ak, and the word for so-so is akan. Yes, you can do some interesting things with that whole situation, but I'm not going to get into all of that right now. So, yeah. I'm just making sure that things are actually properly in here. I will also mention, just because I'm talking about how you're feeling, dal, which is spelled D-A-L, is sad, and ban is angry. So if you're really pissed off, then you're going to say that you're ban. But we'll talk about that in just a little bit. So now you might be noticing that I didn't mention what zad or bad means. These two words are kind of interesting. First off, zad is actually meaning day. You'll actually hear this word used quite often in multiple different instances. But as for bod, basically all that means is bye. Usually only used amongst close friends, and sometimes you'll also hear bud if you're kind of saying bye bye. But both of those are rare, only really used amongst close friends. So please keep that in mind and don't necessarily use those words very often. So, yeah. I believe that is actually pretty much the most important ones for actually introducing. I will also mention, though, tadi, which is spelled T-A-D-Y. Tadi is actually is also a very important word. Usually you'll say, Zidane, tadi, because tadi is basically the equivalent of how are you. There's no actual word specifically for how are you, or words for how are you, because you could say the word for how, you could say the word for are, and you could use the word for you, but tadi has honestly just is so much easier to say. So by saying tadi, it's just what people use. In fact, the only word that is technically within tadi is which means are. So, but it can also mean is. There's no real plural or plural or singular tense, really, for a lot of different things. So, That's why you can just use for is or are. For now, if you want to say that your name, that's actually going to be you're actually going to be saying ia and then your name. So that would literally translate to I am and then your name. Speaking of which, let's actually enter into the world of the pronouns, which I know people are going to get really upset about how this actually works. So first off, e, which is actually a y. So yeah, or yeah, it's complicated. You can pronounce it however you want. Most people will actually realize what you mean. If you say ya or e, then you're fine. Most people will actually understand what you're trying to say because, yeah. But the possessive is actually very special because it's yik. And that's an important thing to actually realize with a lot of the different words, is that if you want to use the possessive version of each of these words, then you would add the k, which is two Ks, and I don't know why I decided that that was going to be how it was going to be said, but yeah, yik is how you would actually say it. So if you want to say I am, so just as an example again, Zephram, that would be how I would say my name is Zephram. You're not going to say yik and then yeah, because obviously there is a word for name, but you're rarely ever going to use that. So instead you're going to say I am, and then you're going to say that. You can obviously do the longer version with name, but I'm not going to get into that today. So yeah. So next up, let's actually talk about he/him, which is, of course, be, spelled B-E. This is a very, like I said, these are common words. If you're pointing out to if you're pointing to someone, you'll say be. If you're talking about something that is a guy's possession, then you would say bk. Oh, that was hard to say actually. Bk. And if you want to say you to a specific person, then you would add ni onto the top, onto the end. So if you see a guy and you're saying, "Hey, you," you would say Beni. And that's how it goes. As for if it was a girl that you're talking to or you're talking about, then you would say bo, which is B-O. Yeah, it's pretty actually common. So bo, bok, boni, those are the main words that you're going to be using often. Speaking of which, ni, which is the basically the way to say you, is actually very rarely used by itself. The reason I mention this right now is because of the fact that for the most part, if they are going to say ni, they're going to add some other word to represent it. So, like I said, if you're specifically talking to someone, then you'll say boni, beni, or deoni, and we'll talk about deoni in just a sec. But that's basically it. And with deoni, remember that is a plural version. So now, what do you do if someone is non-binary or blah blah blah? You don't know what their gender is. Very rarely will you use ni. Instead, if they you're gonna basically have to guess at their gender. So if they look more masculine, you'll say Benny or Boni. You're also gonna have to use their name and all that jazz. It's complicated to say the least. Now, obviously, you're probably wondering, how do you say your? Like, you may think, oh, that would be whatever it is. So, for example, Benny, Benik. But actually, you're actually very rarely going to use that. Instead, you're still going to be using bik or book. And if it's for a plural version, then you would still say dik. It's a complicated situation, but it's honestly a lot easier than saying Deonik. That's just way too long for. I mean, obviously, it's not like the longest thing ever, but yeah. We should actually go on to Eo, which is we or us. And obviously, if you're saying ours, then you would say Eok. Usually, this is usually only used between for husbands and wives, basically saying that this house is theirs or something like that. There are other, obviously, anytime where it's multiple people own the thing and you are in that group, then you would say Eok for saying that's yours. This is the only one of the pronouns that you will never add ni to, because obviously ni does not mean anything. I will actually mention now that I've actually gone over everything, basically, like I said, deok is, or deo is basically the plural form. Basically, anytime that you're specifically talking to multiple people, whether it's multiple guys, multiple girls, you're going to say deo ni, or you're going to say deo. Just use deo a lot, because one, you're never really it could be multiple different people of multiple different genders and all of that stuff, but they really don't want to. They didn't want to make multiple versions of, oh, those guys, oh, those girls. So they just decide, oh, we'll use deoni whenever we're talking about multiple people. So yeah, that are not including us. Basically, it means they them. Now, what if now? Should you ever use ni by itself? No. Very rarely should you ever use ni by itself. Primarily because it is often used in the bedroom. Basically, it's a term of endearment. So sometimes people will say that they love that they if they say I love you, they'll use ni sometimes as basically the term of endearment. Don't ever say it to just a random stranger, because then they're gonna think, oh, you have a freaking crush on me. What the fuck? So yeah, be careful of that, because people get confused if you use it. Now, there has actually been some recent history, because for the most part, transgenderism and all these different things that happen with the LGBT community haven't actually happened out in the rest of the universe. They don't really understand that. But in recent years, in the Acieo in the elemental multiverse, when they eventually came to Earth, they started to come up with this word Baoni as basically a way to say you without necessarily because they aren't necessarily certain of the gender of the person, because things are just really confusing on Earth. So that's how they interact with people on Earth. Basically just saying Baoni it's a safe word that's not necessarily going to be considered inappropriate. So yeah. The important thing to note, though, is that with all of these different ni verb words, they would all just translate to you in English, which is honestly a bit confusing to someone who's learning Acieo. So yeah, it's weird, like I said. But yeah, now you may be wondering then, what about species that can change their gender? Specifically things like changeoids or Kodakians. I haven't mentioned this much yet, but basically Kodakians and changeoids are a bit in a weird situation where they can change their appearance to look like basically anyone they want. Changeoids are able to completely change their appearance completely, and and Kodakians, again, they can make themselves look like anyone specifically that they want to, even if that's a different gender than them. So the question is, what do you call them? Well, if you don't actually know what they are, then you would call them by whatever their specific gender is in their new state is. So let's say that you're talking to a Kodakian who's disguised as a woman, but they're actually a guy. You would still say boni, or bo, or buk, basically all of those different words. If you don't necessarily know that they are actually a guy. If you do know that they're a guy, then use the Bay versions. Unless they are specifically using it as a way to make sure that they are not actually known to be what their gender is. Basically, if they're disguising themselves to go on a mission or something, oftentimes you will still use their normal versions. Kodakians and Changenoids have actually gotten really used to doing this, and they never screw up. So if basically Kodakians can see each other's true forms all the time. So if you're walking, so if a Kodakian is walking past another Kodakian, they see that they're disguised, they'll refer to them as that as whatever gender they are in that disguise, as it's the best way to actually handle it in case there is actually some emergency and they have to hide themselves. It's all complicated, and I don't want to get into all of those details right now, but yeah. You may also be wondering, since Changenoids are basically just blobs, how do you actually tell the gender of them? There is actually a way, but it's more specifically connected to their original forms, because Changenoids actually did look humanoid before, and would look either masculine or feminine in their true forms, and it wouldn't be that big of a deal. Nowadays, though, they actually don't really have any real distinguishing markings to actually tell you what gender they are. Most of the time, they'll just be referred to as Changenoids because of the fact that, like I said, there are no Changenoids anymore that are good. So they'll, except for like one, there's one Changenoid in the entire universe that is still good, and he is masculine. So nowadays they basically consider all Changenoids as masculine if they do need to talk about them specifically, but usually they'll just call them the Changenoid, the Changenoid, the Changenoid, over and over again, because of the fact that it is a dirty word and they all hate Changenoids. It is not, do not think that it is racist, because it is not. It is completely because of the fact that they are at war and they hate them. Everyone hates Changenoids at this time. The king of the Changenoids, who is still on the good side, no one actually refers to him as a Changenoid. They just refer to him as the lost king. That's it. So yeah, keep those things in mind. If they are humanoid-looking Changenoid, you will still refer to them as as just Changenoid, rather than going with the whatever gender that they specifically look like. But sometimes people will use Bani or Boni, depending on what gender they are. And it's still very rare to say Deuni about Changenoids, but they do sometimes if they are talking about multiple of them. So yeah, that is your first lesson on the Acieo language, talking about the different words. Again, that's pretty much it. Next time we will actually be going over the elemental words and their differences between the elemental words, as well as their normal versions of their words. So a good example of this I will actually mention right now is sha versus sha. Sha means shut up. Sha means ice. So there you go. We'll talk more about that in a future video. But anyways, guys, hopefully you have enjoyed this video. If you did, please leave a like, subscribe if you're new, or if you just found out about this channel from the other freaking thing. Yes, subscribe to Intrepid Books, and of course, leave your thoughts and theories. I guess thoughts and questions down in the comments below. Of course, if you are gonna leave a question, please mark it as a question, please. Actually, use a question mark. Oh yeah. And of course, please if you do want to support the channels even more, then definitely head down to the description and check out all of our links down there, including the other two channels, as well as the social medias, and the ways that you can support us financially, including the Patreon, the merch store, and all that jazz. But anyways, guys, this has been Intrepid Books, and I will see you guys next time. But on!